Well, welcome on back. Welcome on back. Welcome on back. This is your host, Professor Tatum, here to lead you through yet another lecture for History 1301. Let's get on into it. Here we will be reflecting on revolution and looking beyond independence and looking beyond the Atlantic coast where the war for independence is being fought. We'll look at a little bit of context as usual, grappling with the question of what is a revolution, and then we'll grapple with the concept of created equal, which was a fundamental piece, of course, to the independence movement. And then we'll examine what was revolutionary about the American Revolution, and then take a look at some things going on beyond the Atlantic coast around the same time. So let's start out by grappling with that question: what is a revolution? A revolution can be seen as a sudden, radical, or complete change, okay, or it can be seen as a fundamental change in political organization, especially the overthrow or renunciation of one government ruler, substitution by another by the governed. Doesn't necessarily always have to be an overthrow, okay, in the sense of somebody being forced out of power. This can happen through a kind of a political process like voting, something along those lines. Hell, even a political coup, right? The Constitution, as we'll see moving forward, is in a sense perhaps a type of revolution or coup. But anyway, I'm jumping ahead of myself there. Another way of looking at a revolution, though, is a fundamental change in the way of thinking about something, a change in paradigm. Okay, mathematically, a revolution is a complete circle, right? It's transforming things, taking things from one point, taking them all the way around. And I think we can see some of these things reflected throughout the American Revolution to an extent, but there's also some blocks. Okay, so let's examine moving forward here how much of a revolution we see at play, okay, as we look into concepts like all men being created equal, and seeing how that fit or did not fit with certain groups of individuals. Created equal. All right, this was a fundamental principle of the War for Independence. This was a very prominent line in the Declaration of Independence that stated that all men are created equal. Well, there's already a fundamental problem there, right? All men are created equal. But what about women? And some people say, oh, well, they're talking about men in the terms of humanity and all men and women. Well, are they? Women, as we know, served crucial roles in the revolution. They worked not only in the homespun movements, doing things like creating American products and clothing, having their spinning bees. They also acted more directly in the war as Molly pitchers and cat followers. We saw that women like Deborah Sampson even got directly involved in the combat. Women were also given a great deal of responsibility, both throughout the Revolution and in the early Republic, in their roles as wives and mothers. Okay, they were bestowed with this responsibility, which we come to call Republican motherhood. And this was this concept in which women were expected not only to care for their homes and families, but to raise their children in a way that would make them productive members of the new American Republic. Okay, and instilling liberal ideas into them, teaching them about the history of what became the United States and kind of bestowing American principles into their children. Despite all this, women were still largely marginalized well after the Revolution, both in the colonial period and during the Revolution, and continuing well beyond the Revolution. Women were denied a kind of legal standing of any kind under this concept of coverture. So, coverture refers to women being legally covered by the men in their lives. All right, so married women would have their legal identity tied to their husbands. Younger women or unmarried women would have their identity tied usually to their father, or if their father was not in the picture, then to their oldest uncle or brother. But there'd be a man who would have the legal rights of a woman, okay? And women were denied under coverture basic things like the right to own property or to sue in court. And those rights were instead given to the men in their lives to kind of act on their behalf. Seems like John Adams forgot to remember the ladies. Remember, we saw that Abigail Adams, his wife, had been writing to him, telling him that, hey, when you go make these new laws for this new government you're forming, please consider us. She's basically asking him in so many words, let's get rid of this concept of coverture and let's make sure that women have a place in this new American society. Because you're talking all about liberty and blah, 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 and all this jazz. Well, we've been contributing to this all along, so make sure you make a place for us. And again, it seems like he kind of forgot to remember. Again, I think it's pretty clear that there are bars from the statement, all men are created equal, women not included there, and that's very clearly at play here. African Americans, we also need to consider when it comes to this concept of created equal. Many were enslaved, and even those who were not enslaved were socially subordinated both before and after the war. Okay, that's nothing that changed as a result of this American Revolution. So if we look, for example, at 1776, the year in which the Declaration of Independence was declared, there were somewhere around 500,000 enslaved African Americans in the US. But by 1790, there were 700,000 enslaved people. Now, of course, I never share no specific numbers or dates, but what we can see here is at the start of this Declaration of Independence, in which this statement is declared that all men are created equal, and they're talking about liberty and consent to the governed and natural rights, which are supposed to be universal and God-given. There are less enslaved people than there are once they get the ball rolling after the revolution. All right, showing us that slavery is growing in the colonies. This was largely a product, by the way, of a continuation of those colonial slave laws, like the hereditary slave code. Remember, which had determined that the status of a child's mother would determine whether or not they'd be enslaved. So basically saying that an enslaved woman's children would be born enslaved. That led to a kind of perpetual growth of slavery in the United States, all right, because they continue those kinds of laws despite their claims for all people being created equal. Or all people really created equal if they're being born into slavery. This slavery was consistently growing as a result of reproduction between not only enslaved people, but also in several cases, unfortunately, records show us, between enslavers and enslaved women. Um, I, I can't even really say sometimes consensually, sometimes not, because then we have to get into the whole debate of, is there ever really an example of an enslaved person being able to consent to sexual relations with their enslaver? There's some kind of issue there with the dynamics that make it not fully consensual. But regardless, we see a big boom in slavery within the early years of the Republic, showing us that slavery is certainly still at play, despite these claims of all men being created equal and there being these universal natural rights, et cetera, as the basis of the independence movement that was driving the revolution. It's also very ironic that the Patriots, throughout the revolution and in the years preceding, when they were leading their big protests against the British Empire, used what was referred to as the language of liberty. Essentially, it's a sort of propaganda where they'd use certain terminology to gain support for their movement. The word patriots for themselves developed out of this. But one common thing they'd say is that they say that they were slaves to British tyranny. Very ironic, considering that many of them were themselves enslavers, and even those who were not were allowing slavery to continue. This revolution, which is supposed to be bringing natural rights and assuring that all men are created equal, didn't do much to address this issue here. Another thing that continued as a tradition from the British colonies into the United States would be that enslaved African Americans would continue to be treated as property rather than people, or they'd be legally defined as property. So again, not much humanity being granted here. Not seeing much very revolutionary about this. Something else that's pretty ironic is considering the views of slavery from Thomas Jefferson, who of course was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, where this concept of all men being created equal was coined. Thomas Jefferson's views on slavery are a bit complex. They certainly developed throughout his life. So he himself enslaved hundreds of people throughout his lifetime. And in his early life, he seemed to overall be opposed to the concept of slavery and the institution of slavery. Despite being a slaveholder himself, he had some kind of moral qualms with it. And then later in his life, about his middle-aged life, he started describing slavery as something like having a wolf by the ears. All right, so just imagine that metaphor. Imagine if there's a big rabid wolf growling in your face, foaming at the mouth, and the only thing stopping it from biting you is you're holding it as tight as you can by the ears. Now, that's a very unpleasant situation, right? You're probably hurting this wolf, which isn't pleasant to do. And you're also kind of in this unpleasant situation, having to hold it back so it doesn't bite you. That's no fun for you or for the wolf. But if you let go, that wolf's going to bite you and things are going to get even worse. Okay. And that's how Jefferson was describing slavery here, saying it's an unpleasant situation, but it is what it is. And it's going to be worse if we try to just let it all go. It's going to cause more problems. Then in his later life, he argued in favor of what he called diffusion, which is a bigger step for justifying slavery. He said that the likelihood of slave rebellions had increased throughout the years that slavery had been growing in the United States. So the best way to lessen the likelihood of a rebellion was to spread slavery throughout the nation so that there would be less places for enslaved people to run to. there'd be less of a sense of, oh, it's just these people here enslaving us. They're the problem. All we got to do is get rid of them. He says if we're all in this together, then we don't have to worry about the potential danger of letting the wolf go by the ears. So definitely seems to be finding several ways to justify not only the existence of slavery in the United States, but promoting the growth of slavery here as well. Then we got to consider the issue of Sally Hemings. So Sally Hemings was an African American woman who was enslaved by the Jefferson family. She lived with Thomas Jefferson's family at Monticello, which was their estate, and her bedroom was right close, just a few steps away from Thomas Jefferson's bedroom. And Sally Hemings had several children who were fairly complected, and their DNA shows that they were fathered by Bale Jefferson. So some people argue, well, that could have been Thomas Jefferson's brother. I mean, I guess possibly, but if we consider all the factors here, his bedroom's right next to hers. He also ended up freeing her children while continuing to enslave other people. Furthermore, records show that he was at Monticello right around the times where it would add up to her becoming pregnant. So all factors kind of do point toward old TJ being the daddy. Guess what, Thomas Jefferson? You are the father! And most historians do agree that it seems most likely that Thomas Jefferson was the father of her children. Okay, again, there's an argument that can be made there that this could be perhaps a consensual relationship they had. But again, there's just a sense of power dynamics. If there's an enslaver and enslaved person, maybe we can see a sense of like Stockholm syndrome, but is there truly a level of consent there? That's highly debatable. Okay, I lean more toward no. Despite all of this, we got to consider that African Americans had been active in the American Revolution on both sides. Of course, there had been some who had been offered freedom by the British under Lord Dunmore's proclamation and the Phillipsburg Proclamation, but there had also been several who had fought on behalf of the Patriots and the Continental Army. And some of these enslaved people who had joined the Continental Army were granted freedom. Remember, for example, in Rhode Island, they offered freedom to any enslaved people who joined from their state. But a lot of these people were just re-enslaved after the war. As I suggested, many of them didn't really have much of a say in whether or not they were in a fight in the war. They were kind of voluntold and put back onto the plantation or wherever it was that they were working after the war. Again, not much revolutionary there for African Americans. They're kind of still seeing the same conditions both before and after the war. We also need to consider the conditions for indigenous Americans before and after this revolution, which again is based on concepts like natural rights and all men being created equal. Now, the War for Independence certainly had impacts on various nations of indigenous peoples in different ways. Many of them participated directly in the war, and some of them did absolutely fight on behalf of the Patriot Army, hoping to get a better deal by the end of the war. But remember, they were not even consulted in this Treaty of Paris of 1783, even though these are lands that they had lived on in many cases for generations and generations. They have worked with various groups of Europeans and now Americans, both diplomatically and militaristically, yet they're not even being treated like nations of people. They're not being considered in these peace talks, which determine what's going to happen to them and to their homelands. They're still considered and treated as savages well after this revolution. They're certainly not being treated as if they're created equal. As we're going to see from here, there's going to be kind of a constant thread playing out throughout history. Indigenous nations being coerced or pressured into signing treaties and pushed out of their homelands. So basically, it'd be something like they convince a few groups of individuals that it's in their best interest to leave their homelands, and then they have everybody else kind of abide by it. So an analogy I give in History 1302 is assume I come to you and I say, you know what, things are not looking good for you. You are destined to fail my class because the almighty power of my class is inevitably going to overwhelm you. All right. They make those kinds of arguments. They'd say, you're inevitably going to fall to white American civilization as we all expand out into your homelands, and it's going to be bad for you and your kids because there's inevitably going to be war and you're going to be crushed and defeated. And so I say, in your case, instead of failing the class, why don't we work out an arrangement? I'm really looking out for your best interests. I can put together an exam for you that you can take in 2 weeks that'll have 5 essays and, 100 ID terms, and you have the 2 weeks to study for it. And you think about it and you say, man, that sounds like a real pain in the ass, and I really don't want to do that, but If I fail the class, that's going to impact my financial aid and that could set up my degree plan and that can really cause me all kinds of trouble. So you eventually come around to my idea and I manage to convince you that it's in your best interest to sign an agreement saying you'd rather take this test than fail the class. All right. So you sign the agreement. Then I show up in class the next day and I tell everybody, okay, guys, I hope you're all ready for this big test you'll have coming up. The rest of the class is going to look at me like, what the hell are you talking about? And so, yeah, I have an agreement right here signed by one of your classmates saying that you all agreed to take this test instead of finishing the class. Well, that's kind of what would happen here. Again, once these people had been coerced into believing it was in their best interest to sign away their homelands and to move out, they didn't necessarily have the authority to speak for their entire nations or bands in most cases. Yet here, all these soldiers would show up and say, "Hey guys, we got agreements saying that y'all are getting out of here. So if you know what's good for you, you better go. Otherwise, we're ready to fight." Does that sound like the kind of conditions that somebody who has the same natural universal rights as the others should have to go through? Does that sound like their consent is being taken into consideration at all? Not really. We also need to consider property ownership. We're still seeing the same type of people for the most part owning property and controlling property rights as had before the war, right? So the same kind of people owning property before the war largely were the same ones owning property after the war. We need to understand, though, that property ownership in the late 18th century and into the early 19th century had a far different meaning than it does in the 21st century. Now, there certainly is a sense of status and liberty and just all around pleasure that comes with property ownership in the 21st century, but it's far different than what was the case here. People without property, so even non property owning white men, were treated as inferior to property owning white men. They were not even allowed in many cases to do things like vote. Okay, property ownership was frequently a requirement to even be able to vote or to serve in politics. So if we're holding this kind of standard that somebody has to have ownership of property to even be able to participate in government, how does that stand in line with this concept of all men being created equal or all people having these universal natural rights? I don't see that it does. I think we can see that the American Revolution was not so revolutionary in some cases, right? There were several opportunities here for it to own up to a whole new level of potential that it didn't. Okay, it still kept the same groups of people marginalized in the same types of way for the most part. I do want to argue, though, there were certainly some very revolutionary aspects of the American Revolution. This should not be undermined. Right? We can recognize that there's not just black and white, good and bad, point A, point B. We can recognize the complexity of history by looking at the American Revolution. Okay, we can see both shortcomings and legitimate successes here. Okay, we see both change and continuity. And we see it was very revolutionary in the sense of what John Adams described in the source that y'all read as a revolution of mind. Okay, there's new ideas about politics and government. This is the first attempt of taking these ideas of people like John Locke, these ideas of liberalism inspired by the Enlightenment, and putting them into action. This is one of the few governments throughout world history by this time who had not been ruled by an emperor or a monarch. Okay, so that within itself is very revolutionary. They also rejected those ideas of things like the divine right of kings or hereditary succession of political leaders. They didn't believe in dynasties. Again, that comes back to people not being born into a sense of royalty or nobility. We do see an element of all men being created equal. Now, again, though, there are certain ways that this is true on paper, yet if we consider the status of slavery or property ownership, right? People are inheriting property if they're born into a family with property. People are inheriting that status of slavery if they were born under a mother who was enslaved. So there are some kinks in this, but this is something they're pushing toward. Okay, this is something that is being tried largely for the first time. And they really are aspiring to create a nation based on the consent of the governed. Again, we saw several shortcomings that stand perhaps counter to this, but there are attempts being made, and we need to not allow our biased 21st century perspective to make us so short-sighted that we can't recognize a sense of revolutionary nature in that, while also accepting the facts that there are several people being largely marginalized in a way that does seem to counter this. This American Revolution, I want us to understand, also gave birth to new ideas about liberty, right? And this inspired future progressive action throughout American history. This would set forth that idea that all men are created equal. And this is something that people ever since have been pushing toward, all right? Marginalized groups of Americans frequently turn back to these ideals that were set forth in the Declaration of Independence and that were argued to be the basis of the American Revolution. We have a foundation as a result of this revolution to be pushing for more as we move forward, okay? Now, all that said, please, I don't want us to get this misconception that there was a time when there was no liberty, and then that gave a little liberty, and we've gotten more and more liberty over time, and now we're the freest we have ever been throughout human history. So we need to understand the progressions of liberty are not linear in that way. Okay, they got to ebb and flow throughout time. There are cases when there are tremendous bursts of liberty, and then there's retractions where some of that liberty gets taken away, and then there's more bursts of liberty, and then it gets taken away, and on and on and on. Okay. Something else that we can consider that was revolutionary is there were some cases of emancipation, right? While slavery persisted and as we saw, it grew as a whole, there were some Americans who started to realize that slavery was not compatible with the idea of all men being created equal. So I don't want us to just get this idea in our heads that all members of this new America, of this new United States, were hypocrites, and none of them saw the hypocrisy behind having slavery while also advocating natural rights and blah blah blah. Because during the war, the states of Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire had already abolished slavery, and after the war, states like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Connecticut began pushing for gradual emancipation. All right, so there are some efforts being taken in several states here toward emancipation. Now, it's not national at this point. So, again, there are still people within the nation who are having those kind of conflicting ideas about all men being created equal and natural rights. But some people are starting pretty early on, even during the war, to recognize there's problems with that and starting to push in a more progressive direction to create more of a sense of liberty for some people. Now, it's not to say that all African Americans were treated equally in every sense to other people, or that non-property owners were treated equal to all other people, etc., or that women were treated equal. There certainly was a good sense of marginalization at play, but they're seeing that slavery does not fit anywhere within this new mindset that they're trying to develop as a result of this revolution. Okay, and that again, I would argue, in a sense, is very revolutionary. There are also several individual cases of emancipation throughout several states. Another way that we can see that the American Revolution absolutely was revolutionary was in the sense that it sparked what was known as the Age of Revolutions. Okay, so other people throughout the world, many of whom were in colonies under empires, began to take similar types of actions and began having revolutions with similar types of ideals. Okay, ideals of liberty and all men being created equal, these kind of Enlightenment ideals. All right, so for example, in France, people of France in the late 1700s overthrew their monarchy and established a republic. Now, as we'll see moving forward, that republic was unfortunately short-lived and it got really bloody and ugly, but still, that idea is being driven here in this revolution. The late 1700s and into the early 1800s, there was an uprising of enslaved people overthrowing their French colonizers, and they had a successful revolution. Throughout the Spanish Empire, Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela, all starting in the early 1800s and into the 1820s, had wars for independence, okay? Again, driven by these same types of ideals that were prevalent in the American Revolution. We can see in many cases this kind of sparked off a powder keg, spreading this idea throughout the world that people had of revolting against monarchs and against empires and pushing for more liberty based on these ideas of consent of the governed and these more Enlightenment type ideas. Governed, right? These more Enlightenment type ideas. So that's a lot to grapple with there in terms of revolutionary and not so revolutionary aspects of the American Revolution. But the other piece of what I wanted to look at in this lecture are things that were going on around the same time as the American Revolution, but that were happening beyond where the war for independence was being fought, which was, of course, largely constricted to the eastern seaboard along the Atlantic coast, right? So if we look to the Gulf Coast, for example, you guys should have learned by now from the book talk, Independence Lost in the Ben Franklin's World podcast, that the Spanish had a strong presence in the Gulf Coast and had been causing some trouble for Great Britain down there that was distracting their troops and their resources away from the American Revolution, right? So, for example, you saw that in Florida, Bernardo de Galvez was leading campaigns against the British to try to reclaim Florida for Spain. And remember, he was very successful in recruiting support locally and in gaining reinforcements. The author of Independence Lost seems to argue that that was largely a result of his enthusiasm compared to John Campbell, the British commander's lack of enthusiasm. And he's always complaining that, oh, Florida is just this big swamp, where Bernardo de Galvez seems fired up about it, saying this could be the new jewel of our empire. There's so much potential here, and blah, blah, blah. And then after the Battle of Pensacola, Bernardo de Galvez, largely as a result of all the support he was able to gain and the reinforcements he was able to receive, was able to reclaim that territory for Spain. And from there, the Spanish proceeded on to attack the British in the Caribbean. So the French also were there alongside the Spanish, fighting the British in the Caribbean. And again, the Spanish came into the Caribbean after defeating the British in Florida, and they were able to deal enough damage to the British there that they kind of relieved the French Navy, allowing the French Navy to sail on up to Yorktown. And remember, we saw that at the Siege of Yorktown, or the Battle of Yorktown, whichever term we want to use, the French Navy blocked off the York River, which prevented any supplies from coming into Cornwallis and his guys. Also prevented the British from being able to escape via the York River. And it also prevented the British Navy from being able to come in to provide support for Cornwallis there at Yorktown. Now, there had been a small skirmish of the French Navy defending the York River and the British a little further out, but they were able to block off that York River. And from there is really how the Patriots and their French allies were able to surround Yorktown and pressure Cornwallis to surrender at that last major battle of the American Revolution. In many ways, while this largely gets overlooked, this campaign of Spaniards down in the Gulf Coast, in places like Florida and the Caribbean, ended up tying pretty directly into the American Revolution and had a lot of implications on the way the war turned out by turning the tide in favor of the U.S. and their allies there at Yorktown. You also should have learned that along the Gulf Coast, indigenous nations were trying to form confederacies to block European expansion into the region. All right, they by this point had the British, they've had the Spanish, there had been French presence for some time, and they just want to keep people out to get them to leave alone. So they tried following examples that they'd seen of indigenous peoples up in the north who'd been forming big confederacies, kind of forming pan-Indian type movements to fight against European colonizers. And the groups to the south tried, often with little success, to do the same. There's really a lot going on here in the Gulf Coast, definitely during the years of the American Revolution. And these actually tie pretty closely into the Revolution. Another thing we saw is British loyalists in the Gulf Coast. Remember, really struggled. So you guys heard the example of people like James and Isabella Bruce, who were plantation owners along the Gulf Coast. And they remained loyal to Britain throughout the war. And at the end of the American Revolution, Britain offered most loyalists reparations for any damages to their property that had been occurred throughout the war, right? Kind of as a thank you for their loyalty. But people like the Bruces and other loyalists here in the Gulf Coast did not receive any such support. Okay, they appealed to receive some payment for damages done to their property throughout the war. And they were told, oh, sorry, your colonies were not actually in the rebellion. Okay, they weren't part of the rebellion, so they're not covered. So thanks for your loyalty, but you're SOL. And so we kind of see, in that sense, maybe for people like the indigenous peoples and for loyalists in the Gulf Coast region, that the American War for Independence actually led them to lose independence in a sense, right? Indigenous peoples no longer can live independently. Now they're having to work together to try to resist European expansion. And they're not having to grapple with the presence of Europeans and Americans in different ways. The loyalists here in this region also, who have moved largely to this region to try to have a sense of independence, starting up independent farms, or unable to do so because now their property has been destroyed as a result of this war. And they're not receiving any support from the British Empire. So for them, their independence is being lost as a result of the American War for Independence. Pretty fascinating how this all ties together. There was far more also going on throughout the American Revolution, really surrounding mostly the years of the Declaration of Independence. So, for example, remember, as you learned from the West of the Revolution book talk by Claudio Sant, and that same Ben Franklin's World podcast in the decades leading up to the American Revolution, Russians had been moving slightly further south into North America. They had a presence a little earlier on up in the Alaska region, where they were invested in the sea otter trade. They'd come in and killed a lot of the Aleutian people and gotten really heavily involved in the sea otter trade there. And they were moving gradually southward, seeking more trade. And they weren't really interested in any large scale colonization or anything like that. But when the Spanish got word that they were coming down closer to their settlements here in California, they thought, well, what's to stop them from coming down even further south into some of our more valuable colonies where we have very valuable resources? We can't allow this to happen. And so they began really increasing their presence up here in their northern territory of North America. Claudio kind of jokingly refers to this as perhaps the first Red Scare. But that's pretty much what's happening. They're kind of panicking about this Russian presence and rushing to have a stronger colonial presence further up north. So by the 1760s, they had began really setting up more missions and presidios throughout the northern part of their empires, especially in California. So in San Diego, for example, they'd established a mission in the late 1760s. And it seemed at first like the local people, the Kumeyaay, that's Kumayay, Kumeyaay, Kumayay. The Kumeyaay people seemed interested in the missions, all right? And they started coming to them kind of willingly, seeking baptism. It seems very likely that they were either there for practical reasons of survival as Spanish disease was spreading throughout the region, or many of them being farmers. And again, we talked about before how farmers would sometimes come to missions during seasons where they were struggling to grow crops to get some food and shelter, right? Others perhaps thought that the Spanish God might offer them more favorable conditions than they'd been seeing and provide them perhaps a sense of protection from these new colonizers. But for whatever reason, throughout the late 1760s and into the early 1770s, they seemed pretty interested in this Spanish missionary project in San Diego. But it was pretty clear over time that the Spanish had power dynamics in mind. They greatly marginalized all the indigenous peoples and put them at their mercy. So, for example, there's records of Spanish friars whipping Kumeyaay people on many occasions. Also, many of them felt as if perhaps they weren't receiving as much food as they were promised by living in these missions. And very similar to what we saw in the Pueblo Revolt, hundreds of Kumeyaay people came together and carried out a mass assault one night against the Spanish settlements there in San Diego, destroying their towns, burning down the churches, killing Spanish settlers. And that was a devastating blow to the Spanish Empire. Okay, all this again was occurring throughout the years of the protest movements and then the independence movement that was going on in these Eastern English colonies that later became the independent United States. Something else going on around this same time period was the Dominguez and Escalante expedition. So this was a Spanish expedition that tried to connect their colonies in Santa Fe, New Mexico, right here west of Texas, to their colonies here in California. They particularly wanted to get connection to Monterey. So they had some mission settlements in both colonies, and they just wanted to kind of get some establishment over the ground in between. Now, on paper, they had sovereignty over all this territory, but they really had no idea what lay between these two colonies. And that's made very clear by early maps they had before this expedition. And throughout this expedition, they found themselves very heavily dependent on indigenous peoples and Indian guides for survival. All right. They had no idea where they were going. They kept winding up lost. At one point, they hit the Grand Canyon, and it wasn't the great picturesque moment where they're sending postcards to mom and dad. It was, crap, how are we going to cross that thing? And eventually, as some of their Indian guides abandoned them, they realized they were lost. They were starving. They went through nights of cold weather, and they didn't know how they were going to survive. So they eventually gave up and said, "Screw this. Let's turn back to Santa Fe." Now, in the process, they did develop some pretty uh, quality early maps, but even the maps, it's Claudio Sant argues, seem to have been inspired by artwork of native people who they encountered along the way. And on this return expedition, they depended again on support from indigenous peoples. Okay, they found themselves in situations where they were starving to the extent that they were eating things like horse hides and porcupines. So they came and sought support from some of the Pueblo people here in the region in the southwest borderlands, and groups like the Hopi and Zuni would house them and provide them food and shelter for temporary periods of time as they were off on this expedition. And they tried, in a couple cases, records show, to convert these Native Americans as they were seeking shelter and refuge with them. And they were just turned down blatantly, said, "No, we're not interested, dude. We'll help you survive, but no, thank you." All right. This Dominguez and Escalante expedition as a whole seems to demonstrate the heavy dependence of European colonization on indigenous people support. Okay, again, so maybe like we'd already seen before with things like the support offered by Doña Marina and the conquest of Mexico, or the support of Squanto and the Wampanoags in Massachusetts. Here again, we're seeing a clear example of European dependence on indigenous people support in colonial America. Very clear example of European dependence on Native American support in colonial America. I'm saying that multiple times because it sounds very significant and like a great exam ID term. Several historians also date that around 1776, which of course is the year that independence was declared, right around that time is when the Lakota Sioux first arrived in the Black Hills. The Black Hills, we need to understand, were going to become the sacred homeland of the Lakota, and they would come to recognize it as the birthplace of their nation, okay, of their people. They were kind of born again as a people here in the Black Hills, and they felt a spiritual connection to this land that they would maintain throughout the decades moving forward. And they were here for about 100 years. And as you'll see in History 1302, if you haven't already taken it, about 100 years after arriving here, they're going to face some problems when the U.S. government and the U.S. Army learned that there were gold in the Black Hills and decided that they were willing to do some real shady things to try to get their hands on that gold. Remember, the Lakota had arrived here, though, because they had been one of those several indigenous groups impacted by the Treaty of Paris of 1763, which ended the 7 Years' War. And as all these new British colonists were moving into where they had been living, they had to move further and further west. And as they moved further west, they began to adopt buffalo hunting as their primary means of survival. And it was their pursuit of buffalo that led them into the Black Hills. So that also kind of helped them develop this strong spiritual connection with buffalo, as well as their connection to the Black Hills and surrounding areas where they would wind up here right around the same time that the independence movement was kicking off. Okay, so perhaps this is all the American origin story of the Lakota Sioux Nation. I think, as we can see here, that the American Revolution and the period in which it occurred is a clear example of that complexity of history that I'm always talking about, right? We can just truly embrace the complexity here by looking beyond the revolution, okay? There's far more than just redcoats and patriots fighting it out. There's loyalists, there's indigenous Americans, there's African Americans, there's women all contributing in different ways and having their own experiences. And if we look beyond the East Coast, we see that the Spanish have all kinds of things going on as well. Groups of Native Americans like the Kumeyaay and the Pueblos who were meeting with the Spanish during the Dominguez and Escalante expedition are all having their own experiences, right? So there's this very rich history playing out as this revolution unfolds. Furthermore, we can see complexity in the sense of grappling with the concept of how revolutionary this revolution was, right? We can consider, on one hand, that it gave birth to these ideas that would continue to be used throughout generations for people to push for more progressive action, to push for more liberty. Yet there is also perhaps a big failing we can recognize simultaneous with that, in which several groups of people were marginalized to an extent where the ideas of all men being created equal and there being natural or universal rights really kind of come into question. But you guys now have all the information and evidence you should need to succeed on exam one. This is the last of unit one here. So I'm going to go and wrap this all up. Let me know if you have any questions, of course. Otherwise, I'll see you on unit two. Over and out.